When Leiningen reached this stage of reasoning, he felt for the first time since the arrival of the ants that his confidence was deserting him. His skin began to creep. He loosened his collar. Once the devils were over the trench, there wasn't a chance in hell for him and his men. God, what a prospect, to be eaten alive like that. For the third time, the flames emulted the attacking troops and burned down to extinction. Yet the ants were coming on again as if nothing had happened. And meanwhile, Leiningen had made a discovery that chilled him to the bone. Petrol was no longer flowing into the ditch. Something must be blocking the outflow pipe of the third and last cistern. A snake or a dead rat? Whatever it was, the ants could be held off no longer, unless the petrol could by some method be led from the cistern into the ditch. Then Leiningen remembered that in an outhouse nearby were two old, disused fire engines. Spry as never before in their lives, the peons dragged them out of the shed, connected their pumps to the cistern, uncoiled, and laid the hose. They were just in time to aim a stream of petrol at a column of ants that had already crossed and drive them back down the incline into the ditch. Once more an oily girdle surrounded the garrison. Once more it was possible to hold the position, for the moment. It was obvious, however, that this last resource meant only the postponement of defeat and death. A few of the peons fell on their knees and began to pray. Others, shrieking insanely, fired their revolvers at the black advancing masses, as if they felt their despair was pitiful enough to sway fate itself to mercy. At length, two of the men's nerves broke. Leiningen saw a naked Indian leap over the north side of the petrol trench, quickly followed by a second. They sprinted with incredible speed towards the river, but their fleetness did not save them. Long before they could attain the rafts, the enemy covered their bodies from head to foot. In the agony of their torment, both sprang blindly into the wide river, where enemies no less sinister awaited them. Wild screams of mortal anguish informed the breathless onlookers that crocodiles and sword-toothed piranhas were no less ravenous than ants, and even nimbler in reaching their prey. In spite of this bloody warning, more and more men showed they were making up their minds to run the blockade. Anything, even a fight midstream against alligators, seemed better than powerlessly waiting for death to come and slowly consume their living bodies. Leiningen flogged his brain till it reeled. Was there nothing on earth could sweep this devil spawn back into the hell from which it came? Then, out of the inferno of his bewilderment, rose a terrifying inspiration. Yes, one hope remained, and one alone. It might be possible to dam the great river completely, so that its waters would fill not only the water ditch, but overflow into the entire gigantic saucer of land in which lay the plantation. The far bank of the river was too high for the waters to escape that way. The stone breakwater ran between the river and the plantation. Its only gaps occurred where the horseshoe ends of the water ditch passed into the river, so its waters would not only be forced to inundate into the plantation, they would also be held there by the breakwater until they rose to its own high level. In half an hour, perhaps even earlier, the plantation and its hostile army of occupation would be flooded. The ranch house and outbuildings stood upon rising ground. Their foundations were higher than the breakwater, so the flood would not reach them, and any remaining ants trying to ascend the slope could be repulsed by petrol. It was possible, yes, if one could only get to the dam. A distance of nearly 2 miles lay between the ranch house and the weir, 2 miles of ants. Those two peons had managed only a fifth of that distance at the cost of their lives. Was there an Indian daring enough after that to run the gauntlet 5 times as far? Hardly likely, and if there were, his prospect of getting back was almost nil. No, there was only one thing for it. He'd have to make the attempt himself. He might just as well be running as sitting still anyway when the ants finally got him. Besides, there was a bit of a chance. Perhaps the ants weren't so almighty after all. Perhaps he had allowed the mass suggestion of that evil black throng to hypnotize him, just as a snake fascinates and overpowers. The ants were building their bridges. Leiningen got up on a chair. "Hey, lads, listen to me," he cried. Slowly and listlessly from all sides of the trench, the men began to shuffle towards him, the apathy of death already stamped on their faces. "Listen, lads," he shouted. "You're frightened of those beggars, but you're a damn sight more frightened of me, and I'm proud of you. There's still a chance to save our lives, by flooding the plantation from the river. Now one of you might manage to get as far as the weir, but he'd never come back. Well, I'm not going to let you try it. If I did, I'd be worse than one of those ants. No, I called the tune, and now I'm going to pay the piper. The moment I'm over the ditch, set fire to the petrol. That'll allow time for the flood to do the trick. Then all you have to do is wait here all snug and quiet till I'm back. Yes, I'm coming back. Trust me," he grinned, "when I finish my slimming cure." He pulled on high leather boots, drew heavy gauntlets over his hands, and stuffed the space between breeches and boots, gauntlets and arms, shirt and neck with rags soaked in petrol. With close-fitting mosquito goggles, he shielded his eyes, knowing too well the ants' dodge of first robbing their victim of sight. Finally, he plugged his nostrils and ears with cotton wool and let the peons drench his clothes with petrol. He was about to set off when the old Indian medicine man came up to him. He had a wondrous salve, he said, prepared from a species of chafer whose odor was intolerable to ants. Yes, this odor protected these chafers from the attacks of even the most murderous ants. The Indian smeared the boss's boots, his gauntlets, and his face over and over with the extract. Leiningen then remembered the paralyzing effects of ants' venom, and the Indian gave him a gourd full of the medicine he had administered to the bitten peon at the water ditch. The planter drank it down without noticing its bitter taste. His mind was already at the weir. He started off towards the northwest corner of the trench. With a bound he was over and among the ants. The beleaguered garrison had no opportunity to watch Leiningen's race against death. The ants were climbing the inner bank. Again, the lurid ring of petrol blazed aloft. For the fourth time that day, the reflection from the fire on the sweating faces of the imprisoned men and on the reddish-black cuirasses of their oppressors. The red and blue dark-edged flames leaped vividly now, celebrating what? The funeral pyre of the 400, or of the hosts of destruction? Leiningen ran. He ran in long, equal strides with only one thought, one sensation in his being. He must get through. He dodged all trees and shrubs except for the split seconds his soles touched the ground. The ants should have no opportunity to alight on him. That they would get to him soon, despite the salve on his boots, the petrol in his clothes, he realized only too well. But he knew even more surely that he must, and that he would, get to the weir. Apparently the salve was some use after all. Not until he reached halfway did he feel ants under his clothes, and a few on his face. Mechanically in his stride he struck at them, scarcely conscious of their bites. He saw he was drawing appreciably nearer the weir. The distance grew less and less, sank to 500, 3, 2, 100 yards. Then he was at the weir and gripping the ant-hulled wheel. Hardly had he seized it when a horde of infuriated ants flowed over his hands, arms, and shoulders. He started the wheel. Before it turned once on its axis, the swarm covered his face. Leiningen strained like a madman, his lips pressed tight, if he opened them to draw breath. He turned and turned. Slowly the dam lowered until it reached the bed of the river. Already the water was overflowing the ditch. Another minute and the river was pouring through the nearby gap in the breakwater. The flooding of the plantation had begun. Leiningen let go of the wheel. Now, for the first time, he realized he was coated from head to foot with a layer of ants. In spite of the petrol, his clothes were full of them. Several had got to his body or were clinging to his face. Now that he had completed his task, he felt the smart raging over his flesh from the bites of sawing and piercing insects. Frantic with pain, he almost plunged into the river, to be ripped and splashed to shreds by piranhas. Already he was running the return journey, knocking ants from his gloves and jacket, brushing them from his bloodied face, squashing them to death under his clothes. One of the creatures bit him just below the rim of his goggles. He managed to tear it away, but the agony of the bite and its etching acid drilled into the eye nerves. He saw now through circles of fire into a milky mist. Then he ran for a time, almost blinded, knowing that if he once tripped and fell, the old Indian's brew didn't seem much good. It weakened the poison a bit, but didn't get rid of it. His heart pounded as if it would burst. Blood roared in his ears. A giant's fist battered his lungs. Then he could see again, but the burning girdle of petrol appeared infinitely far away. He could not last half that distance. Swift changing pictures flashed through his head, episodes in his life, while in another part of his brain a cool and impartial onlooker informed this ant-blurred, gasping, exhausted bundle named Leiningen that such a rushing panorama of scenes from one's part is seen only in the moment before death. A stone in the path, too weak to avoid it. The planter stumbled and collapsed. He tried to rise. He must be pinned under a rock. It was impossible. The slightest movement was impossible. Then all at once he saw, starkly clear and huge, and right before his eyes, furred with ants, towering and swaying in its death agony, the pampas stag. In 6 minutes, gnawed to the bones. God, he couldn't die like that. And something outside him seemed to drag him to his feet. He tottered. He began to stagger forward again. Through the blazing ring hurtled an apparition which, as soon as it reached the ground on the inner side, fell full length and did not move. Leiningen, at the moment he had made that leap through the flames, lost consciousness for the first time in his life. As he lay there with glazing eyes and lacerated face, he appeared a man returned from the grave. The peons rushed to him, stripped off his clothes, tore away the ants from his body that seemed almost one open wound. In some places, the bones were showing. They carried him into the ranch house. As the curtain of flames lowered, one could see in place of the illimitable host of ants an extensive vista of water. The thwarted river had swept over the plantation, carrying with it the entire army. The water had collected and mounted in the great saucer, while the ants had in vain attempted to reach the hill on which stood the ranch house. The girdle of flames held them back, and so imprisoned between water and fire they had been delivered into the annihilation that was their God. And near the farther mouth of the water ditch, where the stone mole had its second gap, the ocean swept the lost battalions into the river to vanish forever. The ring of fire dwindled as water mounted to the petrol trench and quenched the dimming flames. The inundation rose higher and higher because its outflow was impeded by the timber and underbrush it had carried along with it. Its surface required some time to reach the top of the high stone breakwater and discharge over it the rest of the shattered army. It swelled over ant-stippled shrubs and bushes until it washed against the foot of the knoll whereon the besieged had taken refuge. For a while an alluvial of ants tried again and again to attain this dry land, only to be repulsed by streams of petrol back into the merciless flood. Leiningen lay on his bed, his body swathed from head to foot in bandages. With fomentations and salves, they had managed to stop the bleeding and had dressed his many wounds. Now they thronged around him, one question in every face: would he recover? "He won't die," said the old man who had bandaged him, "if he doesn't want to." The planter opened his eyes. "Everything in order?" he asked. "They're all gone," said his nurse. "To hell." He held out his master a gourd full of powerful sleeping draught. Leiningen gulped it down. "I told you I'd come back," he murmured, "even if I am a bit streamlined." He grinned and shut his eyes. He slept.